the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from A Perfumed Scorpion by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. The example of Christianity. I have recently noticed an interesting example of the deterioration of human beliefs, even in an area where there has been continuous teaching of specific doctrines for close on 2,000 years. A study carried out in Britain showed that among Christians, while 70% believed that there was a personal God, only 30% believed that there was a devil. Furthermore, only a minority, an average of 44%, held that Christianity was a better religion than Buddhism. Among Catholics taking part in the same study, only 50% believed in the devil, while a full 92% believed in an everlasting punishment in hell. Again, in the same study, as a result of being asked factually verifiable questions as well, the research concludes that people believe more strongly in matters which cannot be verified than in ones which can. From the total of Christian believers questioned, only 1 in 3 believed in human evolution. Quite apart from several other matters which came up in that paper, published in 1962 and now quite famous, it surely is interesting to observe that the religion of a large number of religious people is at variance with the dogmas of religion which they profess, in spite of their having been exposed to its virtually unopposed specific teachings for many centuries, nearly 2,000 years. How successful is education? If Buddhism is better than Christianity, why remain a Christian? If there is no God, how can one be a Christian? If there is no devil who is presiding over the everlasting punishment in hell, how can hell be something which is still believed in? On what evidence or by what process are some of the Christian beliefs accepted and others discarded? People used to quote, "I think, therefore I am," but surely it is a matter of "I believe it, therefore it must be so." Cogito ergo sum of Descartes, 1596 to 1650. Huxley showed that this phrase, when analysed by Cartesian methods, really boils down only to "something called thought exists." It is a Sufi contention that truth is not discovered or maintained by the mere repetition of teachings. It can only be kept understood by the perpetual experience of it. And it is in the experience of truth that the Sufis have always reposed their trust. Sufism is therefore not "do as I say and not as I do," or even "do as I do," but "experience it and you will know." Modifications through imagination. The knowing, of course, has to be primary. Resorting to secondary renditions is all very well, but as Rumi said, you cannot reach the milk by way of the cheese. Speak to each person in accordance with his understanding. This aphorism used by Sufis bears study. The Sufi can only teach where there is a public demand, as well as an external goal. The public can perceive the goal only when ready to do so. It holds true in the teaching situation, where you can measure the understanding of the student. But such is the distortion of understanding in any general population, caused by the biases which cultures implant, and the programming and inflammation of the mind produced by so many pressures, that I feel we could modify this slogan in dealing with the general public to "Speak to everyone, they will modify it according to their imagination." It is often said that one should ignore obtuseness and never tackle it head-on, that by definition you can do nothing about it. How convenient it would be if things were really as simple as that. Experience shows that sometimes, at least, you must deal with obtuseness. Otherwise, it may indeed happen that obtuseness will deal with you. If someone were to ask you what people it was among whom you would find Christians who believed that Buddhism was a better religion, that there was a God but no devil, that concrete facts were less reliable than beliefs which could not be proved, and that there was no devil but there was an everlasting punishment in hell, would you be inclined to think that it was in Britain? Sufi analysis of education. After that gallop in strange but local country, we may return to our Sufic method of looking at education as carried out by the concentration of indicated impacts. First, I would like to summarize what Western people's state education is. A recent study published in the United States tells us that Western education may be split into three major categories. 1. The indoctrination system, which is generally called the transmitting of the values and disciplines of the culture to the next generation. 2. The idealistic system, which believes that what is inside should be allowed to come out. This has been called Romanticism. 3. The interaction system, the most modern type, which stimulates the student and develops him or her by feedback, also known as progressivism. The Sufi attitude to these three modes is that indoctrination alone is undesirable, that idealism may ignore that there are things to put in as well as to bring out, that interaction depends for its success upon a knowledge of what, when, and how to feed back in order to enable the development, possession of knowledge, and enrichment to take place. The interaction, which is the closest to the Sufi attitude, demands that it be served by experiences which are themselves products of real understanding. In their education, therefore, the Sufis operate a method of working with their pupils which is, because based on the possibilities of the situation, sometimes mystifying to observers. The theoretical approach, making people do things or learn things because this incantation is held to be good in itself, is probably very far behind us, though I cannot forbear from quoting to you the results of an investigation into an aeroplane crash as a consequence of the folklore method of education. A wide-bodied jet with nearly 300 passengers on board was coming into land at Nairobi Airport, Kenya, one day, with a captain who had logged more than 18,000 flying hours. The plane was pulled out of its attempted landing when just within 70 feet above some rocks and scrub. It had been trying to fly below ground level. The captain had been with the company, one of the world's biggest, for 30 years. 13% of captains in this airline, it is stated, have failed their jumbo training courses, the highest failure rate in the world. Other world airlines have averaged only 3.5% failures. Investigations by their Airline Pilots Association have shown that the course given to pilots does not actually test the ability to fly the aircraft, but it is heartening to read that the working party wants the exam to be replaced by a company exam based on what pilots actually need to know to fly an aircraft. As a comparison, the American airline United is quoted as having only one failure to pass in 250 tests of pilots. Is modern education designed always on interaction? What are its sources and objectives? Sufi education is based on Sufi knowledge. What interests many outside people, I fancy, and always has, is not so much what Sufi knowledge can be, but how it is that Sufis have so much knowledge of things which other people are concerned about. I have already said that the Sufi answer to this is that they get this other knowledge. Recently noted in ancient Sufi classics are references to spaceflight, power in the atom, evolution, time and space theory, navigable balloons, sphericity of the earth, etc., as a byproduct of what modern researchers would doubtless categorize as holistic or comprehensive mentation. At any rate, it is to us a byproduct, however useful in our professions. So when we talk of education, we must admit that the Sufis are fundamentally preoccupied with their own kind of knowledge. They are deeply interested in what other people call education, but this is mainly because, in a world where cultural transmission of information and abilities is the preferred method, the nearer people come to the truth about ordinary things, the nearer they will be to the Sufi experience of objective fact, beyond culturally transmitted experience. Who would admit to ignorance? Sa'di, the classical Sufi poet, in his Rose Garden, makes a reference to this when he says that human ideas of knowledge are so fallacious that even if all conventional knowledge were to be removed from the world, there would not be one person who would admit to being ignorant. Sa'di continues in pointing out the educational problems of value-laden teaching, with a little aside about a Muslim and a Jew. To my amusement, he says, a Jew and a Muslim were having an argument. The Muslim said, "If I lie, may I die a Jew." And the Jew, with equal vehemence, swore that if he were to break his bond, he would wish to be regarded as a Muslim, like his despised opponent. It is on such murky pools as these, deeply filled with assumptions and conditioned bias, that people heroically try to erect educational structures. They will try, too, to produce or elicit, condition or cajole, out of them the more balanced, fulfilled, socially acceptable man or woman. The Sufis are not always popular for having said that for every person there are differing circles of belief, including those which are held by the surrounding community, and those which are known by direct perception. Or for saying that education should come from knowledge, not theory. The aim. To help to provide people with the means to hold on to the norms of their society while acquiring the understanding of a deeper truth, without either disturbing their own equilibrium or that of their society, is the aim of Sufi education. As one Sufi has said, if ordinary people who admit the imperfection of their knowledge can sustain society, how much more can the Sufi manage to retain his equilibrium, faced both with the principles of the environment and the knowledge of where it fits in with an ultimate reality? Flexibility. What the Sufis would regard as preparatory education, preparing people for deeper experiences as well as enabling them to fit into the existing society, involves above all a flexibility of approach which many regard as inconsistent with ordinary life. That this is not so is amply demonstrated by at least 1,000 years of connected Sufi history in the Middle East and Central Asia, in the Near East, India and the Far East, even at times in parts of Europe. So first of all I would list, as useful to anyone, the Sufi effect of familiarizing people with concepts which they have not considered before. These are things which do not come into everyday life with the same sharp outline that the Sufis, through poetry, stories and other teachings, give them. An obvious example is to be aware that circumstances alter cases, and that things considered to be absolute for some purposes are only relative for others. There are innumerable examples in the stories which I have published. One Western thinker has noticed this problem and this need. Familiar things happen, says Alfred North Whitehead, and mankind does not bother about them. It requires a very unusual mind to undertake the analysis of the obvious. Alfred North Whitehead, Science in the Modern World, 1926, page 6. We feel that such a mind is unusual only because human thought has got into a rut. This is one tale which has not yet been published. A camel and a mouse both happen to be opponents of what non-thinkers, mindless people, today love to call elitism. Each claimed that it should have what the other had, not something measured in accordance with a purported assessment of its requirements. So water was given to each of them when thirsty, but both died. The camel died of thirst because it was given the mouse's ration. The mouse died of drowning when it fell into the camel's portion. Assumptions and points of view. This form of study involves, too, being able to see things from more than one point of view. Again, we have published extensively on this. A third vital approach is to question and examine one's assumptions without, however, becoming compulsive about it. In parts of the East, of course, people have adopted this technique in isolation, and so deeply that it gives rise to the sensation that nothing is worth doing at all, except, perhaps, examining assumptions. This and many other abuses are due to the employment of what are really instruments, not as instruments, but as holy writ or as magical spells. It is no different from repeating, say, the multiplication tables, and expecting this to cause some marvelous multiplying effect. Indeed, the pointing out of the instrumental function in totems and formulae is a characteristic of Sufis. Some thinkers, of course, in the West and even in the East, take this to such extremes that they regularly attract large audiences by declaiming at great length that people should not listen to teachers. The lesson is, therefore, that any instrument can become a totem, but few, if any, totems can become useful instruments, and then only when other circumstances are in alignment. Sequential and holistic thought. In terms of the lateral specialization of brain hemispheres, I think we have an interesting illustration here. The linear item, say a phrase composed of originally semantically significant words, becomes a dirge or magical mantram, which is transferred to the mainly holistic hemisphere in the form of something not by then endowed with sequential meaning. A word becomes a form. There is a clue perhaps to what should really happen in the Sufi tradition, that a word must have a sound, a form, and a meaning, and they must all be appreciated together. It is certainly true that Sufi experience appears to make things which are perceived as ideas come into the field of action, and actions to prompt ideas. This may also be one source of Sufis doing things which have a physical shape but no verbal explanation, though they originate with an inspiration and not in the form of words. It could even be maintained that Sufi education aims at getting both sides of the brain to work and helping them to operate at times in concert, but not alternately. Hence, we may say that if the methods of Sufi learning were to be written down, the theory would be easier, but while theory becomes possible of understanding by this method, Sufism itself then becomes impossible to learn. Narratives. But a great deal of the Sufi teaching in action can be observed or deduced from narratives. While we can analyze many of these, it is lucky that they almost always have dimensions which mean that their entire versatility can seldom be completely rendered in banal terms and therefore worn out. Even some statements which have a cracker-barrel philosopher's application can also be used to expose the deficiencies of the aphorism when pushed beyond a certain unregenerate point. Take such a beautiful and arresting saying as one which is current now both in the East and the West: "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." When this is repeated enough, with the customary sage nod or clever wink, most people imagine that it is worn out, it becomes a truism. But when it is submitted for further examination, you may add to this something extracted from Sufi educational and psychological experience. This is to observe that, unless it is understood how, when, and where to make that step, the assertion is devoid of the profound weight which casual and unthinking adoption so often ascribes to it. Another thought, emanating from a state of deep contemplation, can be fed back into sequential terms and has been known to produce a useful capacity for learning beyond the obvious. If only he knew less, or more, he would be wise. Of course, he would have to know it in a somewhat different way. Shifting of attention. The shifting of attention from the expected to the unexpected is a technique which has some value, and it makes use, in Sufi circles, of conventions by violating them to point to assumptions as to how a story will end and enable one to contemplate for a second or so peculiar possibilities. A certain human being once found what he realized was a magical ring. He put it on his finger and, with the usual formula, said, "Ring, do your work." In a twinkling of an eye, he found himself transformed back into the being which he had been before he had found a ring and wished to be human. Then there is a joke which serves to see, sometimes in a flash, how people are out of communication and not in the way they imagine themselves to be disconnected either. The Minister of Health of a certain country sent a telegram to the governor of a distant province. The message said, "Shall we send you more doctors?" The reply which came back from the yokels was, "Send us less of the accursed magic spells which are smiting us with disease, and we won't need any of your doctors." There is another humorous tale which, among other illustrations, emphasizes that people often think and act in isolation, not realizing that this may sooner or later end in trouble, both in the ordinary world and in spiritual studies. There was a countryman who had sold his watch because, he told a visitor, the trains ran on time within earshot, and he therefore did not need one. "But how do you tell the time, say, in the early hours of the night, when there are no trains?" "That's easy. I have a bugle by my bed. When I want to know the time at night, I blow it hard, as loud as I can, out of the window. Someone always shouts, 'Who's that fool making such a noise at 3:10 in the morning?'" Basis of Sufi theory and practice. Sufi knowledge is the knowledge of something beyond customary human perceptions, yet reached through the very world whose characteristics often stand in the way of such perceptions. This could well be a summary of the theory and practice of the Sufis. Seen in this way, something of a logic in one's approach may be reconstructed. I say reconstructed, of course, because from the Sufi viewpoint no argument or rationale is needed, no general theory of how and why one gets from A to B, because the Sufi knows about the A and B. The rationale exists for the benefit of those who may wish to approach the path but need a theory within which to do so. It might be noted, too, that by no means everyone demands such a theory. But the majority of people do, and the others will understand to whom one is talking in this regard. Energetic attention. Even this coherent, linear thinker for whom we are effectively working has to make a jump of energetic attention to grasp things which lie beyond the reach of his sequentially operating brain alone. His education has to take a new turn when he is ready for it. This point comes, by the way, at the stage indicated by this interchange. A would-be seeker asked a Sufi, "How long will it take me to arrive at the point of true understanding?" The Sufi answered, "As soon as you get to the stage where you do not ask how long it will take." This is not a conundrum. The Sufi, as I am sure you will realize, is merely saying, in a memorable way, that if your attention is on one thing, you will not be able to concentrate upon another. Learning, among the Sufis, requires attention to other things than how long things will take. Such ideas are not by any means unknown in the West, but they tend to be applied to the concepts of concentrated prayer alone, or of doing one's social duty, or heightening one's emotional pitch. The tradition of extra-dimensional perception being subject to specialized techniques apart from the moral and religious, however important these may be, is difficult indeed to find. Supersession exercises. Hence we see the Western convention in these words of John Donne in the 17th century. I neglect God and his angels for the noise of a fly, for the rattling of a coach, for the whining of a door. This is a small example of the possible use of things of this world, this prison of dimensions, to get beyond these dimensions. Oddly enough, it has often been objected that it is absurd to use something in order to transcend that very thing. Yet the smallest example from ordinary life will surely show that that is what we are doing all the time. With the Sufis, however, it is more strongly stressed that this is so. For instance, if you teach someone how to count, starting with piles of stones in order to end up with the relatively abstract Arabic figures, you may be said to have employed the concrete to get to the abstract, and to have used stones as something which you are determined to supersede. If you do not do this, of course, keeping the constant awareness of the supersession factor in front of you, your learning system is in danger of becoming fossilized. You get conditioned to stones. The Sufi teacher's educational mission, too, is to work himself out of a job. This brings us to the seeming paradox and source of great curiosity, the Sufi organization and philosophy or ideology. The purpose of the Sufic learning frame, whether it be a school, a body of literature, or a set of ideas, is both to conduct one further and also to be dispensed with, so that it does not become an end in itself. The visible cults which are well known in the West are degenerations of learning systems, and are those which have failed to observe this essential theory, and hence produced a grotesque. Anonymity of the Sufi. Now we can explain why it is that Sufis hardly ever refer to themselves as such. It is so that the word should not become the substitute for the experience. Sufis throughout history have been known by so many names and styles that it even looks deliberate to outside observers. There are numerous different names for Sufi study centers, for the exercises, for the teacher and the learner. There are Sufi books which read like poetry, which speak of love or religion, which are full of stories or of theology, or even only the lives of saints. How, then, do Sufis know one another? Sufis just do. There is a link which needs no external object, not even a word, to maintain it. But how can we, the outsiders, it may be asked, know that all these people and all these artifacts, literature and so on, belong to the Sufi and no other tradition? Almost always because Sufis put in enough context, references to other Sufis, affirmations about Sufi experience, and so on. But there are many exceptions. For instance, although the major classics, which are numerous, are observable without doubt as Sufic, there are other books which only Sufis realize are Sufic in content and meaning. The classic historical example of this is when the great teacher Ibn Arabi of Spain wrote a book, The Interpreter of Desires, in the 13th century. He was bitterly criticized for pretending to write spiritual materials while really wallowing in love poetry. In a dramatic and historic inquisitorial event, Ibn Arabi himself interpreted the book, The Interpreter, line by line, to show his accusers the meanings in a religious sense which were veiled by his allegory, to their very great discomfiture. This is one of the most famous of all public Sufic teaching exercises. Since that time, informed people have been very chary of accusing Sufis of profanity or even irrationality. So the Sufi entity does not exist like the kind of agency we have for teaching other things. It cannot try to compete with the massive buildings of the law courts. It does not try to claim that its literature is invariably and literally true, irrespective of the state of the surrounding culture. Rather, the reverse. It does not deal in labels, at least not in labels which cannot be peeled off. The institution exists, but its cohesive force, the Sufi would say, is the knowledge which resides within it, which make it exist far more permanently than bricks and stones, theories and other externals. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.